Creative Critical Question 1. At the beginning of our supernatural horror film, Who Is There?, we deliberately used conventions typical of contemporary independent horror, particularly those associated with A24 style movies, while simultaneously challenging the genre's reliance on spectacle and rapid jump scares. Rather than beginning with immediate shock, we prioritized atmosphere, ambiguity, and psychological tension. This slow burn structure encourages the audience to engage actively with subtle narrative cues. My approach was informed by my research into the openings of Insidious, 1408, The Conjuring, and The Awakening, all of which construct fear through restricted knowledge, sound design, and pacing. The film opens with a black screen followed by the A24 ident. Unlike mainstream horror openings that often begin with loud stings, our ident appears in silence. After a brief delay, a low, non-diegetic, eerie sound gradually fades in, peaking as the first visual of Sophia running down the stairwell appears. This delayed layering of sound unsettles the audience before narrative clarity is established, echoing the restrained opening of The Awakening. In Bart's terms, this activates the enigma code. The audience senses threat before it is visually confirmed, prompting questions about what is happening and why. The opening sequence presents Sophia fleeing down a fire escape. However, this moment is structurally a flash forward rather than the chronological beginning. The audience is not informed of the temporal shift until after the title sequence, when Anchorage appears, reading 2 hours earlier. By withholding this contextual information, we construct narrative ambiguity and encourage active audience interpretation. This structural disruption aligns with Todorov's theory, yet we subvert his model by beginning in disequilibrium and then rewinding to a fragile equilibrium. The tracking shot and restricted POV align the audience closely with Sophia's perspective, intensifying urgency and panic. This draws on conventions in Insidious and 1408, where extended movement through liminal spaces such as corridors and stairwells generate sustained tension. The audience witnesses action before understanding its cause, reinforcing Bart's enigma and sustaining narrative uncertainty. Visually, the flash-forward sequence used a cold blue color palette to encode instability and psychological intensity. The muted tones signal disruption and distinguish the sequence from the warmer bedroom scene that follows. When Sophia reaches the alley, the framing compresses the space, transforming an exterior setting into a claustrophobic environment. This subverts Levi-Strauss's binary oppositions of inside versus outside and freedom versus confinement, as a supposedly open space becomes restrictive and threatening. The introduction of a CCTV-style POV briefly shifts identification from Sophia to the unseen watcher. Unlike her unstable handheld perspective, the surveillance frame is static and emotionally detached. This creates discomfort by momentarily aligning the audience with the controlling gaze. As a result, the sequence operates on 3 levels of identification: Sophia's subjective fear, the watcher's surveillance perspective, and a neutral observational viewpoint. This layered structure deepens narrative ambiguity and reinforces the enigma surrounding the unseen presence. Typograph further grounds the film within supernatural horror conventions. Following the chase sequence, the title Who Is There appears in a dark red serif font against a black background. My research into horror typograph indicated that serif fonts are frequently used in Gothic and supernatural horror because they convey tradition and certainty as seen in Insidious. The red color symbolizes danger and violence, while the serif form suggests an enduring supernatural threat. In Bart's terms, the title operates as an action code, punctuating the sequence and anchoring the film within the horror genre. The subsequent bedroom scene establishes a fragile equilibrium. Sophia is represented as an independent 18-year-old living alone, and her vulnerability stems from circumstance rather than incompetence. Drawing on Van Zunen, we avoid objectifying camera angles and instead use close-ups that emphasize perception and agency. Her fear is portrayed as rational and situational. Through Hall's theory of representation, the source of fear is constructed through atmosphere and ambiguity rather than through stereotyped depictions of gender or ethnicity. By situating the threat within the supernatural rather than a male antagonist, we avoid reinforcing traditional gendered horror tropes. The loud knock at the door acts as a clear action code and disrupts domestic safety like The Conjuring. We use traditional spaces such as corridors and doorways to heighten tension. The note that slides through the mail slot simultaneously functions as an action code, physically invading the home, and as an enigma raising questions about the sender. The message "I am here" intensifies psychological threat without revealing antagonist. Moreover, the sequence escalates further when Sophia arms herself with a kitchen knife and shouts, "I have a knife!" asserting agency rather than passive fear. A close-up of her trembling hand holding the knife emphasizes vulnerability while maintaining her active resistance. However, the subsequent medium shot reveals a shadowed figure emerging behind her, visible only through the blurred glass of the kitchen door. This moment marks the controlled release of visual horror, while we delay spectacle through the opening. This shadow functions as a restrained yet powerful conventional horror image. In Bart's terms, it operates simultaneously as an action code, signaling the physical presence of threat, and as an enigma code. Since the figure remains obscured and undefined, the blurred glass prevents full disclosure, sustaining ambiguity and reinforcing the supernatural dimension of the narrative. The binary opposition between the interior safety and exterior danger collapses as the threat appears to penetrate the domestic space. By positioning the horror as an external supernatural force rather than as a gendered human aggressor, we continue to challenge traditional representations of women in horror as passive victims, instead presenting Sophia as proactive yet confronted with forces beyond rational control. The opening ultimately withholds full narrative resolution. Although the shadow confirms the physical presence of a threat, its identity and motive remains unknown, sustaining Bart's enigma and aligning with independent horror preferences for ambiguity over closure. Overall, Who Is There employs recognizable conventions of supernatural horror: darkness, surveillance, unnatural sound, domestic invasion, and symbolic typograph, while deliberately challenging traditional representations of women as passive victims. Through controlled pacing, restricted narration, and a proactive female protagonist, the film both utilizes and reconfigures genre conventions to construct a contemporary and psychologically driven horror narrative.